Naomi Cole stirred awake as the shrill beep of her alarm pierced through the silence of her small bedroom. It was 3:45 a.m., an ungodly hour for most, but for Naomi, it marked the start of another grueling day. She reached out, silencing the clock with a well-practiced motion, before sitting up on the edge of her bed. The dim light from the street lamp outside filtered through the thin curtains, casting faint shadows on the walls. She exhaled deeply, rubbing her temples before standing. Her muscles ached from the previous day's journey, but there was no time to linger in discomfort. She had a long way to go. Moving quietly so as not to wake her children, she navigated the cramped space of their modest home. In the small kitchen, she prepared a simple breakfast, 2 slices of toast with a thin spread of margarine and a cup of instant coffee. The coffee was weak, but it was warm, and that was enough for now. She glanced toward the tiny adjoining room where her children slept. Caleb, her 12-year-old son, and Maya, her 7-year-old daughter, were curled up under their blankets, their soft breathing the only sound in the quiet house. For a moment, Naomi hesitated, allowing herself to watch them. They looked so peaceful in sleep, unaware of the struggles she faced every day just to keep them afloat. Steeling herself, she grabbed her old, worn-out sneakers from under the table. The soles were thinning, barely held together by duct tape, but she couldn't afford a new pair yet. One day, she promised herself. One day, things would be better. At precisely 4 a.m., Naomi stepped out of her house, locking the door behind her. The crisp morning air sent a slight shiver down her spine as she adjusted the straps of her backpack, filled with her work uniform and a small lunch. The street was quiet, the world still asleep, but she was used to the solitude. She took her first step, beginning the long 18-mile trek to Greenridge General Hospital, where she worked as a janitor. It was a journey she had walked every day for the past 6 months, ever since her old car broke down beyond repair. With no savings to fix it and no reliable public transportation that ran early enough, walking had become her only option. Naomi had long stopped questioning why life had to be this difficult. She had learned to push forward, one foot in front of the other, because that was the only way to survive. As she walked through her neighborhood, the houses were dark, their occupants still nestled in sleep. She moved quietly, passing by a few stray cats rummaging through a tipped-over trash can. Further down the road, a lone street cleaner worked to clear away debris from the previous day. Naomi gave him a small nod as she passed, a silent acknowledgement of another person awake before dawn. The first hour of her journey was always the easiest, her body still somewhat rested from the night before. It was during the second hour, when the city began to stir, that the fatigue started setting in. She entered the more developed part of town, where the streets were lined with cafes, boutique stores, and well-kept parks. Unlike her own neighborhood, where sidewalks were cracked and streetlights often flickered, this area was pristine, designed for those who never had to worry about how they would get to work. Naomi kept her head down as she passed the first few pedestrians. The morning joggers in their expensive sneakers barely glanced at her, though some occasionally cast wary looks in her direction. She was used to that. A black woman walking through an affluent neighborhood before dawn raised questions. She reached an intersection and waited for the light to change. A luxury car pulled up beside her. The driver, a middle-aged woman with styled hair and perfectly manicured nails, glanced at Naomi through the window, her eyes briefly widening before she quickly locked her doors. Naomi bit the inside of her cheek but said nothing. She had experienced far worse. Continuing her walk, she thought about Caleb and Maya. Caleb was bright, always burying his nose in science books, fascinated by the workings of the world. He wanted to be a doctor one day. Naomi was determined to make sure he had that chance, even if it meant working twice as hard. Maya, on the other hand, was her little artist, always sketching in her notebook, dreaming up worlds Naomi wished she could give her. She imagined a future where they wouldn't have to struggle. A future where she could drive them to school, buy them clothes that weren't second-hand, and give them the kind of life they deserved. But that future still felt far away. 2 hours into her walk, the exhaustion set in. Her legs ached, her feet sore from the relentless pavement. She stopped for a brief moment at a bench near a bus stop, stretching her calves and rolling her ankles. Just as she prepared to continue, she noticed a police car parked nearby. The officer inside was watching her. Naomi stiffened, quickly adjusting her bag and continuing on. It wasn't the first time she had noticed a patrol car on her route, but she always ignored it. As long as she wasn't doing anything wrong, there was nothing to worry about. The hospital was still another hour's walk away. She pushed forward, the city waking up around her. Cars filled the streets, honking impatiently at red lights. More people appeared on the sidewalks, some heading to work, others leisurely sipping coffee from expensive cups. By the time Greenridge General Hospital came into view, Naomi was drenched in sweat despite the morning chill. She quickened her pace, not wanting to be late. As she approached the employee entrance, she caught a glimpse of herself in the glass doors. Her reflection showed exhaustion, dark circles under her eyes, her hair slightly disheveled from the wind. But there was also something else. She was still standing. Inside, she changed into her uniform, slipping into the familiar rhythm of work. The fatigue of her journey faded as she focused on the tasks at hand. Cleaning hospital floors, sanitizing rooms, ensuring patients had a safe, sterile environment. It wasn't glamorous, but it was important. During her break, she checked her phone. A message from Caleb made her smile. "Hope you're having a good day, Mom. Love you." She replied quickly, her heart warming at the thought of her children waiting for her at home. They were her strength, the reason she kept moving forward despite the pain, the exhaustion, and the endless struggles. When her shift ended, she took a deep breath, preparing for the long walk back. The sun was high in the sky now, the city bustling with life. Naomi stepped outside and glanced at the street corner. The same police car from earlier was still parked there, the officer inside still watching. For the first time, Naomi felt something shift. She had been invisible for so long, just another face in the crowd, another struggling worker nobody noticed. But now, someone had. What did he want? Shaking off the thought, she adjusted her bag and started walking. 18 more miles to go. Officer Jordan Harris sat in his patrol car, parked at the intersection just outside Greenridge General Hospital. He had just finished responding to a minor traffic incident and was taking a moment to sip his now lukewarm coffee when he spotted her again. The same woman. He had first noticed her several months ago, always walking, always alone, at odd hours of the day. At first, he had assumed she was just someone who preferred walking, maybe she enjoyed the exercise, or maybe she didn't live too far. But as time went on, he started seeing her more often, at different points in the city, and always on foot. It wasn't just the walking itself that puzzled him. It was the distance. Greenridge was a large town, and from the direction she always came from, he could tell she was traveling a long way. Too long. Something didn't add up. He watched as she exited the hospital, shoulders slumped from exhaustion. She paused briefly at the employee entrance, adjusting the straps of her backpack before beginning her walk again. Jordan frowned. He had been a police officer in Greenridge for over a decade, and his instincts told him there was more to this woman's story. On impulse, he turned on his engine and eased his patrol car into the street, keeping a fair distance as he followed her. She walked with a sense of purpose, her pace steady despite the obvious fatigue in her steps. Jordan noticed the way she occasionally rolled her ankles, a clear sign of discomfort. Her sneakers, if they could even be called that, were falling apart, barely offering any support. As she walked through the wealthier part of town, the reactions of passers-by caught his attention. Some glanced at her with suspicion, pulling their bags closer. Others barely acknowledged her existence. Jordan sighed. He had seen this dynamic too many times before. People made assumptions based on appearance, never bothering to consider the real story behind a person's circumstances. She reached a crosswalk, waiting for the signal to change. Jordan watched as a woman in a luxury SUV sitting at the red light glanced at her, lips pressing into a thin line before quickly locking her doors. The woman walking, however, didn't react. She simply straightened her shoulders and continued moving. That kind of resilience wasn't common. Jordan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He had spent years patrolling these streets, dealing with all sorts of situations, from petty theft to serious criminal activity. He had met people from every background, some good, some bad, and some simply trying to survive. This woman, whoever she was, wasn't out here causing trouble. She was just surviving. Still, the question remained. Why? Why did she walk everywhere? Why had she never taken the bus? Why had she never accepted a ride from anyone? Jordan followed her at a distance for the next 20 minutes, making sure not to draw too much attention. When she stopped at a park bench to stretch her legs, he pulled his car to the side of the road, watching from afar. She didn't take out a phone to scroll through social media. She didn't call anyone. She simply sat for a minute, rolling her shoulders and stretching her calves before standing again. It was routine. Well practiced. She had done this before. When she resumed walking, Jordan found himself debating whether or not he should intervene. He wasn't sure what he'd even say. "Hey, I've been watching you for months, and I'm curious why you walk everywhere." Yeah, that would go over well. Still, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut. Something was off, and he had learned long ago to trust his instincts. As she neared a bus stop, she paused when a bus pulled up, and Jordan thought for a moment that she was finally going to get on. But instead, she simply stood off to the side, letting the passengers board before continuing on foot. Jordan's frown deepened. If she was willingly passing up public transportation, there had to be a reason. He followed her for another mile, watching as she turned down a quieter street. She was approaching the edge of town now, where houses were smaller, more rundown. That's where she lives, he thought. Sure enough, after another 20 minutes of walking, she reached a small house tucked at the end of a quiet street. Jordan parked his car a few houses down and watched as the front door burst open. 2 kids ran out, their excitement unmistakable. "Mommy." She bent down, scooping them into her arms despite her obvious exhaustion. The transformation was immediate. Her tired expression melted away, replaced by pure love and warmth. Jordan's chest tightened. This woman, who had spent hours walking under the unforgiving sun, past people who barely acknowledged her existence, was greeted like a hero at home. He watched as she led her children inside, the front door closing behind them. Something in him shifted. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore. This was about justice. Jordan had spent years upholding the law, but deep down, he knew there were people who fell through the cracks. People who weren't criminals, who weren't looking for handouts, but who still needed help. And this woman, whoever she was, needed help. Jordan sat in his car for a long moment, staring at the now quiet house. Tomorrow, he was going to talk to her. Not as a cop. As someone who wanted to understand. As someone who wanted to help. With that thought, he turned the key in the ignition and drove off, already forming a plan in his mind. Tomorrow, he was going to find out her story. And if she let him, he was going to do something about it. Naomi Cole woke up before her alarm could ring. Her body had become so accustomed to the early mornings that she no longer needed the shrill beeping to pull her from sleep. She stretched her aching limbs, wincing as the stiffness settled deep in her muscles. She had walked the usual 18 miles yesterday, and her feet were still sore. She let out a deep breath before swinging her legs over the side of the bed. The house was silent except for the rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan in the next room. She glanced at the clock on the nightstand, 3:42 a.m. 3 more minutes before the day officially began. Moving carefully so as not to wake her children, she tiptoed through the dimly lit hallway into the small kitchen. With practiced efficiency, she boiled water for coffee and pulled out 2 slices of bread. The toaster groaned as it warmed the slices, and she stared at them as if willing them to be something more. It wasn't much, but it would keep her going. As she took her first sip of coffee, her gaze flickered to the window. Outside, the darkness still hung heavy, but she could already see the faintest hint of dawn on the horizon. Another long day awaited her, another 18 miles to walk. Her eyes drifted toward the corner of the kitchen, where an old cardboard box sat today. Inside were unopened bills, school permission slips she hadn't signed yet, and a flyer from a community food bank she was too proud to visit. Naomi clenched her jaw and looked away. She had made it this far. She wasn't going to give up now. She finished her coffee quickly before heading to the small room where her children slept. Caleb was curled up in a tight ball, his arms hugging his pillow. Maya lay sprawled across her blanket, one foot sticking out. Naomi smiled faintly before kneeling beside them. She brushed a stray curl from Maya's forehead and placed a gentle hand on Caleb's shoulder. "I love you both," she whispered. "Be good today." Neither stirred. She took one last look before grabbing her bag and heading for the door. The moment she stepped outside, the cool morning air wrapped around her like a thin blanket. She inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the quiet of dawn. It was one of the few moments of peace she had before the day truly began. Adjusting her backpack, she started walking. The first hour was always the easiest. Naomi had learned to pace herself, conserving her energy for the later miles when exhaustion would hit. The first few blocks were familiar, quiet streets, dim porch lights, the occasional stray cat slinking between parked cars. She passed Mr. Reynolds, an elderly man who watered his plants before sunrise every morning. He gave her a small wave, and she returned the gesture. A little further down, she spotted the familiar neon glow of a 24-hour diner. She had never stepped inside, it was far beyond what she could afford, but she often watched as early morning workers sipped their coffee and chatted before their shifts. She wondered what it felt like to start the day sitting down. By the time she reached the main road, the city was slowly waking up. More cars appeared, headlights cutting through the last remnants of darkness. Naomi kept to the sidewalks, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might wonder what she was doing out so early. She had long since stopped caring about the stairs. She had a job to get to. 2 hours in, the pain started. A sharp ache shot through the sole of her right foot, a reminder of the blister she had felt forming the day before. She winced but kept moving. Stopping wasn't an option. As she passed the upscale neighborhood, she noticed the familiar reaction. A woman out for an early jog slowed as she saw Naomi approaching. Her grip on her phone tightened, her eyes darting away as she picked up her pace. Further ahead, a man sitting in his parked car glanced at her briefly before locking his doors. Naomi kept walking, her face impassive. She had learned to expect it. Most of them assumed she was homeless. Or worse. She was neither. She was a mother. A worker. A woman trying to get from one place to another. But people didn't ask questions. They just made assumptions. She shook off the thoughts as she reached the halfway mark. She stopped for a moment, leaning against a street pole to stretch. The sun was beginning to rise now, casting long shadows on the pavement. That's when she saw it. The same police car. The one she had noticed yesterday, parked near the hospital. It was there again, sitting across the street. And the officer inside? He was watching her. A familiar unease settled in her stomach. She adjusted her bag and kept walking, her heartbeat picking up just slightly. Was he following her? No. That didn't make sense. She hadn't done anything wrong. Still, the thought nagged at her. She forced herself to focus on the road ahead. There was still a long way to go before she reached the hospital, and she couldn't afford to get distracted. Her feet burned with every step, but she pressed on. Her shift awaited her. Her children awaited her return. And no matter how hard it got, she would keep moving forward. Because she had no other choice. Officer Jordan Harris sat in his patrol car, gripping the steering wheel as he watched Naomi disappear down the road. His shift had ended nearly an hour ago, but he couldn't bring himself to leave just yet. There was something about her, about the way she walked, the exhaustion in her posture, the determination in her every step, that wouldn't let him look away. He had seen struggle before. As a police officer, he had responded to domestic disputes, evictions, welfare checks. He had witnessed the silent battles people fought every day, often unnoticed by the world around them. But something about this woman felt different. She wasn't asking for help. She wasn't causing trouble. She was just surviving. And that unsettled him more than anything. His mind made up, Jordan put his car into gear and pulled onto the main road. He wasn't going to follow her directly this time, he had already seen where she lived. Instead, he had another plan. If Naomi worked at Greenridge General Hospital, someone there had to know her story. It didn't take long to reach the hospital. The morning shift was already in full swing, with nurses, doctors, and staff moving in and out of the building. Jordan parked in the visitor's lot, making his way inside. At the front desk, a young receptionist barely looked up from her computer. "Can I help you?" Jordan pulled out his badge, though he made sure to keep his tone casual. "Morning. I'm Officer Harris with the Greenridge Police Department. I just have a few questions about one of your employees." That made her pause. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she slowly looked up. "Is there a problem?" "Not at all," Jordan assured her. "I just want to know if you're familiar with a woman named Naomi Cole." The receptionist frowned, tapping a pen against the counter. Naomi, oh. Yeah, she works in janitorial, right?" "That's right. She's nice. Quiet. Always on time, though I don't know how, considering." She stopped herself. "Considering what?" Jordan pressed. The receptionist hesitated before lowering her voice. "I probably shouldn't say anything, but I've heard she walks here. Every day. All the way from the other side of town." Jordan already knew that, but hearing it confirmed made his stomach tighten. No car? The receptionist shook her head. Not that I know of. Some of the nurses have tried giving her rides before, but she always turns them down. She's proud. I think she doesn't want anyone's pity. Jordan absorbed the information. Proud. That made sense. Has she ever been late? Not that I've noticed, the receptionist admitted. Which is crazy, right? I mean, with a walk like that, you'd think she'd be late at least once. But she's always here, always working. Jordan nodded, his suspicions confirmed. Naomi wasn't walking for the exercise. She wasn't walking because she wanted to. She was walking because she had no other choice. And that didn't sit right with him. Thanks for your help, he told the receptionist before turning to leave. He had one more stop to make. An hour later, Jordan pulled into a small auto shop on the outskirts of town. The sign above the garage read Sam's Auto Repair, and beneath it, a banner boasted family-owned since 1985. Jordan had known Sam for years. He had fixed up Jordan's first car when he was fresh out of the academy, and the two had remained on good terms ever since. Stepping inside, Jordan was greeted by the familiar smell of motor oil and the distant sound of a radio playing an old country song. Sam, a gruff-looking man in his 60s, looked up from under the hood of a car. Well, look who it is, Sam said, wiping his hands on a rag. To what do I owe the pleasure, Officer Harris? Jordan leaned against the counter. I need a favor. Sam raised an eyebrow. That usually means trouble. Not this time, Jordan assured him. I just need you to check something out for me. He pulled out the small notepad he always carried in his pocket and jotted down Naomi's address. There's a car at this location. I don't know what shape it's in, but it hasn't moved in months. I need to know if it's fixable. Sam glanced at the address before rubbing his chin. This about a case? No, Jordan admitted. It's about someone who needs help. Someone who's too proud to ask for it. That got Sam's attention. I'll take a look, he said gruffly. No promises, but if it's fixable, we'll figure something out. Jordan nodded. Appreciate it. As he left the shop, he felt a weight settle in his chest. Naomi had been walking for months. Alone. Through exhaustion, judgment, and pain. That was about to change. She might not want help. But she was going to get it anyway. Naomi was already halfway through her walk home when she spotted the police car again. Her heart quickened, but she kept her steps steady, pretending she hadn't noticed. The officer inside, the same one she had seen that morning, was following her again. Not closely, but enough to make it obvious. Her jaw clenched as she adjusted her backpack, ignoring the growing discomfort in her feet. She had already walked nearly 12 miles today, and each step sent jolts of pain through her legs. But she had no time to dwell on it. She just needed to get home. As she reached an intersection, she heard the hum of an engine slowing beside her. The police car eased into place, rolling along the curb. She bit the inside of her cheek. Then came the voice. Excuse me, Naomi exhaled sharply before turning to face him. The officer had rolled down his window, one hand resting on the steering wheel as he looked at her, not with suspicion, but with something else. Curiosity. Concern. She was immediately wary. Yes, officer, she asked, keeping her voice polite but distant. I couldn't help but notice you walking, he said. You've got a long way to go. She forced a tight smile. I always do. The officer hesitated before nodding toward the passenger seat. I can give you a ride if you'd like. She shook her head almost immediately. No, thank you. You sure? I'm sure. Another pause. I don't mean to pry, he said carefully, but I've seen you walking this route for a while now. Every day, rain or shine. It's a long way. Naomi stiffened. She wasn't in the mood for this. Not today. I appreciate your concern, Officer Harris, he supplied. Jordan Harris. She nodded curtly. Officer Harris. But I'm fine. I've been doing this for months. I can handle it. Harris studied her for a moment, his gaze unreadable. I don't doubt that, he said. You seem like someone who knows how to handle things. His words caught her off guard. She expected pity, maybe even skepticism. But there was something else in his tone. Respect. Still, she didn't have time for this conversation. She had a home to get to. With a nod, she turned away and kept walking. To her relief, Harris didn't follow. At least, not right away. But as she neared the final stretch of her journey, she saw him again. This time, he was already parked near her street, waiting. Naomi's pulse quickened. Had he followed her all the way home? She gritted her teeth as she walked past his car, determined not to acknowledge him. But before she could reach her front door, she heard his voice again. "Ms. Cole." She stopped. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag as she turned to face him. "How do you know my name?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even. "I asked around," he admitted, stepping out of the car. Not in a bad way. "I just wanted to understand." Naomi's stomach twisted. She didn't like this. Didn't like people digging into her life. Didn't like being seen. "I don't need charity," she said firmly. Harris held up his hands. "I'm not offering charity." "Then what are you offering?" "Help," he said simply. She let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "I don't need help." Harris sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Look, I get it. You're used to doing things on your own. You've got 2 kids depending on you, and you don't have the luxury of asking for favors. I understand that." Naomi stiffened. "How do you?" "The hospital," he admitted. "I stopped by today. Asked a few questions." Anger flared in her chest. "You had no right to do that." "I know," he said, not trying to defend himself. "But I wanted to understand why you were walking nearly 20 miles every day. And now I do." She didn't respond. She just wanted this conversation to be over. Harris exhaled slowly, glancing at her house. "You're a good mother, Naomi." Her heart clenched at the sound of her name. "I'm just a mother," she said quietly. "No," Harris said. "You're more than that." Silence stretched between them. Then he said something that stopped her cold. "I checked out your car." Naomi's eyes snapped to him, her stomach twisting. "What?" "I asked a mechanic to take a look." "Sam Carter. You might know him." She did. Sam ran the auto shop a few miles away. But she hadn't spoken to him in months. "I didn't ask for that," she said tightly. "I know," Harris said. "But I did it anyway." Naomi's mind raced. That car had been sitting in her driveway for 6 months, collecting dust and rust. It had broken down on her way home from work one evening, leaving her stranded on the side of the road. She had spent weeks calling around, trying to find someone who could fix it for a price she could afford. No one could. So she had let it go. Accepted that it was beyond repair. Accepted that walking was her only option. Now, this cop, this stranger, was telling her he had gotten it checked. Her throat felt tight. "What did he say?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Harris hesitated before answering. "He can fix it," he said. "But it's going to take some work." She swallowed. "How much?" "That's the thing," Harris said. "The community wants to cover it." Naomi's chest constricted. "Naomi." "I said no," she snapped. "I don't take handouts." "This isn't a handout," Harris said firmly. "It's people wanting to help. People who see how hard you work and want to make things a little easier for you." She shook her head, turning away. "I don't want their pity." "It's not pity," Harris said. "It's appreciation." Her breathing was uneven now. This was too much. Too much attention. Too much vulnerability. She had spent months pushing through, forcing herself to be strong, refusing to let anyone see how much it hurt. And now, here was this officer, this stranger, peeling back the layers. Offering something she wasn't sure how to accept. She shook her head again, stepping back toward her house. "I can't," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Harris studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Okay." She blinked, caught off guard. "Okay? I won't push," he said. "But the offer stands." Naomi exhaled shakily. She didn't know what to say. So she said nothing. Instead, she turned and walked inside, closing the door behind her. And for the first time in months, she felt something shift inside her chest. Something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Hope. Naomi barely slept that night. She lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, her mind racing with everything that had happened earlier. Officer Harris knew about her car. He had spoken to the hospital staff. He had found a mechanic to fix the vehicle she had given up on. And worst of all, he had told her that the community, the very people who had barely noticed her existence until now, wanted to pay for it. She turned onto her side, clutching the blanket closer. She had spent years doing everything on her own. No one had ever come to her rescue before. Why now? Why did this officer, a man she barely knew, care so much? She hated how much it unsettled her. She hated that it made her feel something other than exhaustion. She didn't want to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope was a promise that could be broken. With a frustrated sigh, she sat up and glanced at the time. 3:30 a.m. She was up earlier than usual, but there was no point in lying awake any longer. Carefully, she tiptoed out of bed and into the kitchen. The house was still, the only sounds the soft ticking of the wall clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. She went through the familiar routine, boiling water, making coffee, eating 2 slices of toast. But today, the silence felt heavier. She wasn't just preparing for another long walk. She was preparing for another conversation she wasn't sure she wanted to have. Because deep down, she knew. Harris wasn't done. And neither was she. The morning was colder than usual, the kind of chill that settled into Naomi's bones as she stepped outside. She adjusted her backpack and began walking, each step feeling heavier than the last. She had walked this route for 6 months. And yet today, it felt different. Because she wasn't alone. Even though she didn't turn around, she could feel it. She knew Harris was nearby. And sure enough, when she reached the main road, there he was, his patrol car parked on the side of the street, the engine idling. She exhaled sharply, her breath visible in the crisp air. This time, she didn't pretend not to see him. She didn't look away. Instead, she stopped. And waited. Harris didn't make her wait long. The driver's side door opened, and he stepped out, his uniform jacket zipped up against the cold. His expression was unreadable as he walked toward her, hands tucked into his pockets. "You're up early," he said. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "So are you." Harris huffed a short laugh before glancing down the road. "You heading to work?" "Like always." He nodded, rocking back on his heels. "Mind if I walk with you?" Naomi hesitated. Everything in her wanted to say no. But for some reason, she didn't. She shrugged. "It's a free sidewalk." Harris smiled faintly before falling into step beside her. For a while, they walked in silence. The city was still waking up, the streets mostly empty except for the occasional car passing by. The sound of their footsteps echoed against the pavement, and for the first time in a long time, Naomi wasn't alone on her walk. She didn't know how she felt about that. Eventually, Harris spoke. "I know you don't want help." Naomi didn't respond. "I know you're used to doing things on your own," he continued. "And I respect that. But I need you to understand something." He glanced at her, and for the first time, she met his gaze. "This isn't about charity," he said. "It's about people recognizing what you do, what you sacrifice, and wanting to give something back." Naomi swallowed. "I don't need anyone to give me anything," she said quietly. Harris nodded. "I know. But that doesn't mean you don't deserve it." She looked away, her grip tightening on the straps of her backpack. "I've worked hard for everything I have," she muttered. "Everything my kids have. I know that too." She took a deep breath, her steps slowing. "I've had people make promises before," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "People who said they would help. That they cared. And then they left." Harris didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. The silence said enough. She glanced at him again, her expression guarded. "How do I know this is different?" Harris studied her for a long moment. Then he said something she didn't expect. "Because I've been where you are." Naomi frowned. "What?" Harris looked ahead, his jaw tightening. "My mom was a single parent," he admitted. "Raised me and my sister on her own. She worked 2 jobs, barely slept. I remember seeing her come home every night, exhausted. And she never asked for help either." Naomi felt something shift. Because for the first time, she saw something in his eyes. Understanding. "I was just a kid," Harris continued. "Didn't know any better. Thought it was normal. Thought everyone's mom worked herself to the bone just to keep food on the table." His voice grew quieter. "And then one day, a neighbor stepped in. Helped fix our car when it broke down. Another time, my mom's boss gave her an advance on her paycheck so she could buy groceries." He let out a slow breath. "She didn't ask for it. But they did it anyway." Naomi swallowed hard. "And that changed things?" she asked. Harris nodded. "It did." Silence stretched between them again. Naomi kept walking, her mind racing. She didn't know why, but hearing that Harris understood, made something crack inside her. Because she had spent so long believing no one did. Harris glanced at her again. "I know it's not easy to accept," he said. And I'm not asking you to take anything you don't want. But just think about it. Naomi exhaled slowly. She hated that she was considering it. But she was. For the first time in months, she was. They walked the rest of the way in silence. And when they reached the hospital, Harris stopped. "Good luck today," he said simply. Naomi nodded. And for the first time, she meant it. Naomi's shift at the hospital passed in a blur. She scrubbed floors, sanitized rooms, and took out trash bins without much thought, her mind stuck on the conversation she'd had that morning. Officer Harris's words clung to her like an old memory, the kind she had buried long ago. "Because I've been where you are." She had spent so much of her life believing no one understood, that no one cared. And yet, here was this officer, this stranger, telling her he did. She didn't know what to do with that. By the time her shift ended, exhaustion had settled deep in her bones. Normally, she would have braced herself for the long walk home, but today, something was different. Harris was waiting. He was parked near the hospital side entrance, leaning against his patrol car with his arms crossed. Naomi hesitated. She could have ignored him. Could have walked past like she always did. But something inside her told her not to. With a deep breath, she approached. "You're persistent," she said. Harris smirked. "I've been told that before." She sighed, shifting her bag on her shoulder. "Look, I meant what I said earlier. I don't take handouts." Harris nodded. "And I meant what I said too. This isn't charity." She exhaled sharply. "Then what is it?" "It's people recognizing someone in their community who's been fighting alone for too long." Naomi looked away. Fighting alone. That was exactly what she had been doing. Harris let the silence stretch before speaking again. "I talked to Sam," he said. "Your car is fixable." Naomi clenched her jaw. "I don't have the money for that." "You don't need to," he said simply. "The repairs are covered." She shook her head. "I told you, Just listen," Harris interrupted, his voice steady but firm. "It's not just Sam. Other people are stepping up too." Naomi frowned. "What do you mean?" Harris ran a hand over his jaw before meeting her gaze. "The hospital staff started a fundraiser." Naomi's breath caught. "What?" Harris nodded. "A few of the nurses, Sandra, Emily, said they've been watching you come and go for months. They didn't know how far you walked every day. When they found out, they wanted to help." Naomi's heart pounded. She had worked at Greenridge General for over a year. She kept her head down, did her job, and never asked for anything. She had convinced herself that no one noticed her. She had been wrong. "They raised over $500 in just 2 days, Harris continued. "It's enough to cover the rest of your car repairs and a little extra for gas." Naomi's hands curled into fists. She wasn't sure if she wanted to cry or scream. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered. "I know," Harris said gently. "But they wanted to do it anyway." Naomi shook her head, her emotions a tangled mess. She had spent years teaching herself not to rely on anyone. And now, a whole community was stepping in. Her throat tightened. "Why?" Harris studied her for a moment before answering. "Because sometimes, people need to be reminded that they're not invisible." Naomi swallowed hard. She had felt invisible for so long. And now, for the first time in years, she wasn't. She wasn't sure what to do with that. Harris reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. "This is from the hospital staff," he said, holding it out. "It's yours. No strings attached." Naomi stared at it. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. She knew it wasn't just about the money inside. It was about what it represented. People saw her. People cared. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She cleared her throat. "What about Sam?" she asked. "He's not fixing my car for free, is he?" Harris smirked. "Not exactly. A few local businesses chipped in to cover the costs. Said it was the least they could do for someone who keeps this town running." Naomi let out a shaky laugh. "I clean hospital floors, officer." Harris shrugged. "And those floors need to be clean, don't they?" She exhaled, shaking her head in disbelief. This was real. This was happening. For so long, she had believed she had to do everything alone. But maybe she didn't. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something better. She glanced at Harris. "You really don't give up, do you?" His lips quirked into a grin. "Nope." Naomi let out a breath. "Okay," she said finally. Harris raised an eyebrow. Okay? She nodded. I'll take the help. Harris's grin widened. Good. For the first time, Naomi smiled too. And for the first time, she realized how much lighter the world felt when she wasn't carrying the weight alone. Naomi woke up the next morning feeling different. For months, her days had been predictable: wake up before dawn, walk nearly 20 miles, work her shift, and walk home. Every day, her world had been wrapped in exhaustion and survival. But today, something had shifted. Hope. The word felt foreign to her. She had spent years teaching herself not to rely on hope. Hope was fragile, dangerous even. It was the thing that got people hurt. But now, as she sat at her tiny kitchen table, sipping her weak coffee, she couldn't ignore the flicker of something new inside her. Her car was going to be fixed. The hospital staff had raised money for her. A whole community of people she had thought barely noticed her, had come together for her sake. And Officer Harris? Naomi sighed, rubbing her temples. She still wasn't sure how to feel about him. He had pushed into her life, asked questions she didn't want to answer, and forced her to acknowledge things she had spent years ignoring. And yet, he had done it with kindness. With respect. She wasn't used to that. A soft yawn interrupted her thoughts. Mama. Naomi turned to see Maya, her daughter, standing in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Hey, baby, Naomi said softly. Maya climbed into her lap, resting her head against her shoulder. Are you going to work now? Naomi kissed the top of her head. In a little bit? Maya was quiet for a moment before saying, I wish you didn't have to walk so far. Naomi's heart clenched. She had never spoken about it to her children. Never wanted them to worry. But of course, Maya had noticed. She always noticed. Naomi swallowed the lump in her throat. Things are going to get better, sweetheart, she whispered. I promise. And this time, for the first time, she actually believed it. By the time Naomi reached the hospital, she had already decided she was going to keep her head down. She didn't want people making a fuss. She didn't want to be treated any differently. But the moment she stepped through the side entrance, she realized she had underestimated just how much people had been paying attention. Naomi. She turned just in time to see Sandra, one of the nurses, rushing toward her. Before she could react, Sandra pulled her into a tight hug. You should have told us, she scolded lightly. Naomi stiffened, uncomfortable with the attention. Told you what? Sandra pulled back, giving her a look. That you've been walking all this way every single day. Naomi, why didn't you say anything? Naomi forced a small smile. It's just something I had to do. Sandra shook her head, exhaling sharply. Well, you don't have to do it alone anymore. Naomi glanced around, suddenly aware that other hospital staff were watching. Some of them gave her nods, others warm smiles. She didn't know how to feel about that. Listen, Sandra continued, the hospital board is considering a transportation program for staff who live far away. Your story really made them think about how hard some employees have it. Naomi blinked. Her story? When had she become someone with a story? She had always been invisible. A background worker, just another person struggling to get by. Now, people were talking about her. Now, she was being seen. It was overwhelming. Thank you, she murmured, not sure what else to say. Sandra smiled. You're not alone, Naomi. The word stuck with her for the rest of the day. By the time her shift ended, she was emotionally drained. She wasn't used to this, people caring, people looking at her with something other than indifference. As she stepped outside, she almost wasn't surprised to see Harris waiting for her again. She walked toward his patrol car and sighed. You really don't give up, do you? Harris smirked. Nope. She shook her head, but a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. You busy? He asked. Naomi frowned. Why? Sam's got something to show you. Her stomach tightened. Her car. She wasn't sure she was ready to see it. But she found herself nodding anyway. The drive to Sam's auto shop was quiet. Naomi had almost forgotten what it felt like to sit in a car, to watch the world blur past the windows instead of moving step by painful step. When they pulled into the shop, Sam was already waiting outside. The moment Naomi stepped out of the car, she saw it. Her car. Fixed. Shiny. Whole. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Sam walked over, tossing her the keys. She's good to go, he said. New battery, fresh oil, new tires. She's got some years left in her. Naomi caught the keys with shaky hands. This really happened?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Sam nodded. "Took a village, but yeah." Naomi turned to Harris, who was watching her with a small smile. "You did this," she said. His smile softened. "No," he said. "They did." Naomi looked at the car again, emotion swelling in her chest. For so long, she had carried everything alone. She had built walls, convinced herself she didn't need anyone. But now, those walls were breaking. And for the first time, she let them. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. She swallowed hard. Then, for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to say the words. "Thank you." Harris nodded. And Naomi knew, this was only the beginning. Naomi gripped the steering wheel of her newly repaired car, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the dashboard. It had been months since she had been behind the wheel, and the reality of the moment settled deep in her chest. She ran her fingers over the worn leather, blinking back the sting of tears. This was real. The car was fixed. She wouldn't have to walk 18 miles every day anymore. She wouldn't have to endure the exhaustion, the blisters, the stares from people who assumed the worst about her. She could drive. She could get home faster. She could have more time with her children. Sam and Officer Harris stood nearby, giving her space but watching her reaction carefully. "You gonna sit there all night, or are you gonna start her up?" Sam teased. Naomi let out a shaky laugh. "Just, give me a minute," she murmured. Sam nodded, crossing his arms as he leaned against the side of the car. Officer Harris, however, took a step closer. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Naomi swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah. Just, trying to believe this is actually happening." Harris gave her a small smile. "It's happening." She inhaled deeply before slipping the key into the ignition and turning it. The engine roared to life, smooth and steady. The sound sent a fresh wave of emotion through her. She had forgotten what it felt like to sit in a car that worked. To hear an engine that wasn't struggling to keep up. To know she had a way forward that didn't require destroying herself in the process. She exhaled slowly, gripping the wheel a little tighter. Then, after a moment, she turned the car off and stepped outside. She faced Sam first. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. Sam grunted, waving her off. "Don't make it a big thing. Just doing what's right." Naomi's throat tightened. It was a big thing. But she knew Sam wasn't the kind of man who wanted praise, so she just nodded. Then, she turned to Harris. She met his gaze, searching for the right words. She had spent so long fighting to stay independent, to prove to herself that she could survive on her own. But today, she had to admit, sometimes, letting people in didn't make her weak. It made her stronger. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Harris's expression softened. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I just made sure people saw what was already there." Naomi held his gaze for a long moment. She wasn't sure what she had expected when she first noticed him watching her, following her. But it hadn't been this. It hadn't been kindness. She swallowed hard, blinking away the moisture in her eyes before glancing back at the car. "So, what happens now?" she asked. Harris smirked. "Now? We make sure you never have to go through this again." The next morning, Naomi drove to work for the first time in months. The feeling was surreal. She had woken up at her usual time out of habit, still mentally preparing for the long journey. But then she remembered, she didn't have to. She had a car. She could drive. It still felt unreal as she pulled into the hospital parking lot and stepped out. And then she saw them. A small group of hospital staff, Sandra, Emily, and a few others, waiting for her near the entrance. Naomi hesitated, suddenly feeling self-conscious. Sandra grinned. "Look at you, driving like a queen." Naomi chuckled, shaking her head. Emily stepped forward, a little more serious. "How does it feel?" she asked. Naomi exhaled slowly. "Strange," she admitted. "Good, but strange." Emily nodded. "You'll get used to it?" Naomi wasn't so sure. She had spent so long in survival mode that she didn't know how to adjust to anything else. But for the first time in a long time, she was willing to try. Later that evening, after her shift ended, Naomi found herself at the community center. Harris had invited her, saying there was something she needed to see. She wasn't sure what to expect. But when she walked inside, she was met with a room full of people. People from the hospital. People from the neighborhood. People she barely knew. And yet, they were all there for her. She stood frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed. Then, Harris stepped forward. "I told you we weren't done," he said with a small grin. Naomi swallowed hard. "What is this?" Harris gestured toward a table stacked with papers, donation boxes, and lists. "This is the start of something bigger," he said. "The hospital is working on setting up a transportation fund for employees who need it. The community center is organizing a carpool program. And local businesses are pitching in to help people who are struggling to keep their cars running." Naomi stared at him, trying to process it all. "This is because of you," Harris said gently. She shook her head. "No, Yes," he interrupted. "Because people saw what you were doing. And they realized something needed to change." Naomi pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. She had spent so long believing she was alone. That no one saw her. That no one cared. But standing here, in this room full of people who had come together because of her, she realized how wrong she had been. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe. To believe that maybe, just maybe, things really could get better. That she didn't have to carry everything alone. That hope wasn't so dangerous after all. She took a deep breath and looked at Harris. "Okay," she said. "Tell me what I need to do." Harris's smile widened. And Naomi knew, this was only the beginning. Naomi sat in her car, staring at the steering wheel with a mixture of disbelief and apprehension. She had driven to work for the second day in a row, and yet, the feeling still hadn't settled in. Her hands felt steady now, unlike yesterday when they trembled slightly as she gripped the wheel. The drive had been short, so much shorter than the grueling hours she had spent walking. It still felt surreal, arriving at work without aching feet, without a sweat-soaked shirt, without the exhaustion of a journey that had once consumed so much of her energy before she even started her shift. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, locking the door behind her. The hospital was already buzzing with activity, the early morning rush beginning to fill the hallways. As she walked through the staff entrance, she could feel the change in the way people looked at her. Before, she had been invisible. Now, people saw her. "Naomi. Morning." She turned to see Sandra, the nurse who had been one of the first to contribute to the fundraiser, waving at her. "Morning," Naomi said, adjusting the strap of her bag. "How's the car?" Sandra asked, falling into step beside her. Naomi hesitated, trying to find the right words. "It feels different," Sandra chuckled. "Yeah, I imagine it would. No more long walks in the cold, huh?" "No more long walks," Naomi echoed, and the weight of those words settled deep in her chest. They reached the staff lounge, where a few other hospital workers were gathered, sipping coffee before their shifts. The moment Naomi stepped inside, the room quieted slightly, eyes turning toward her. For a brief moment, she felt exposed. Then, someone clapped. And just like that, the room erupted in applause. Naomi blinked, caught off guard. She turned to Sandra, who was grinning from ear to ear. "Told you, people care." Naomi swallowed hard, warmth rising in her chest. She had spent so long believing no one noticed her, that she was just another person struggling in silence. But today, standing in a room full of people who had worked to help her, she realized how wrong she had been. She managed a small smile. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the clapping. "You earned it," Emily, another nurse, said as she walked past, squeezing Naomi's arm gently. "Now come on, we've got a long shift ahead." Naomi nodded, collecting herself as she followed them into the hallway. Maybe, just maybe, things really were changing. That evening, as she drove home, Naomi found herself taking a different route. For months, her world had been limited to work and home, with nothing in between except the endless miles of road she had to walk. But now, as she sat behind the wheel of her car, the possibilities felt different. She had time. Time she had never had before. On impulse, she turned down a familiar street, the one that led to Caleb and Maya's school. The parking lot was nearly empty when she arrived, most of the parents having already picked up their children. But she spotted them immediately, Caleb, her quiet and observant son, sitting on the steps reading a book, and Maya, chatting animatedly with one of her friends. Naomi pulled up to the curb, stepping out of the car. The moment Caleb looked up and saw her, his eyes widened. Maya, still mid-sentence with her friend, turned as well. For a second, neither of them moved. Then, Maya's face split into a grin. "Mommy." She sprinted toward Naomi, throwing her arms around her waist. "You're here," Maya squealed. "With the car?" Naomi laughed, holding her daughter close. "I'm here, baby." Caleb approached more slowly, closing his book and slipping it into his backpack. "Does this mean you don't have to walk anymore?" he asked, his voice cautious, as if afraid to believe it. Naomi knelt down, brushing a hand over his curls. "No more walking," she promised. Caleb's lips pressed together, and for a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something else. But instead, he just nodded. Maya was still bouncing with excitement. "Can we ride in it? Right now?" Naomi chuckled. "Of course." She opened the back door, watching as her children climbed inside, still wide-eyed with disbelief. As she drove them home, she glanced in the rearview mirror, catching Caleb watching her. "What is it?" she asked. Caleb hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I'm glad you don't have to walk anymore." Naomi's throat tightened. "Me too, baby," she said softly. "Me too." Later that night, after dinner was done and the kids had gone to bed, Naomi sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't exhausted. She had time to breathe. Time to think. And for the first time, she found herself thinking about something beyond just surviving. Her eyes drifted to the small notepad she kept near the fridge, where she wrote reminders and grocery lists. Slowly, she picked it up and turned to a fresh page. She hesitated, then wrote, "Goals. Open a savings account. Get a second-hand laptop for Caleb. Find a weekend activity for Maya. Look into night school." She stared at the last one for a long time. For years, she had put aside her own dreams. She had focused only on keeping her children afloat. But what if things could be different? What if she could dream again? She exhaled slowly, setting the pen down. There was still a long road ahead. But for the first time, she wasn't walking it alone. The next morning, Naomi woke up to a text from Officer Harris. "Harris, got some news. Meet me at the community center after work?" Naomi frowned, typing back. "Naomi, good news or bad news?" A pause. Then, his response. "Harris, you'll see." Naomi huffed a laugh, shaking her head. She had no idea what he was up to. But something told her she wanted to find out. Naomi drove to the community center after work, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. She had no idea what Officer Harris had planned, and something about his cryptic text made her nervous. It had been a strange few days. She was still adjusting to the newfound attention from the hospital staff, still getting used to driving again, still processing the fact that she no longer had to walk nearly 20 miles every day just to survive. She had spent months living in the shadows, believing she was invisible. Now, people were noticing her. And she didn't know how to feel about that. By the time she pulled into the parking lot of the community center, the sun was starting to set, casting a golden hue over the old brick building. She spotted Harris standing near the entrance, hands in his pockets, watching her approach. Taking a deep breath, she got out of the car and walked toward him. "You're being mysterious," she said. Harris smirked. "Keeps things interesting." Naomi rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a small smile. "So, what's this all about?" Harris gestured toward the doors. "Come inside." She hesitated for a moment before following him. Inside, she was immediately hit with the sound of chatter and laughter. The community center was buzzing with activity, families, volunteers, local business owners. And then she saw it. A table near the back, covered in flyers, sign-up sheets, and donation boxes. A banner hung above it, simple but powerful. "No one walks alone, transportation initiative for our community." Naomi froze. Harris turned to her, watching her reaction carefully. "What do you think?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The fundraiser at the hospital had been overwhelming enough. But this? This was something bigger. Something that would help not just her, but others like her. Harris continued, "When people heard your story, they started asking questions. Turns out, you weren't the only one walking miles just to get to work. A lot of people in this town are struggling with transportation. Single parents, elderly folks, people working jobs with unpredictable hours." Naomi's hands curled into fists. She had been so focused on her own struggles that she hadn't considered how many others were facing the same battle. She looked around, seeing people signing up, donating, talking about the initiative. "This isn't just about fixing your car," Harris said. "This is about making sure no one else gets left behind." Naomi swallowed hard. Who started this? Harris shrugged. It was a team effort. A few people from the hospital, some local businesses, even a couple of my guys from the department. Everyone pitched in. Naomi pressed a hand to her forehead, shaking her head in disbelief. People had stepped up. Not just for her, but for others. And it had started because someone noticed her. Because someone cared. She took a shaky breath. This is a lot. I know, Harris said. Take your time. She glanced back at the sign-up table, her eyes scanning the different flyers. Then something caught her eye. A volunteer list. Her name was already written on it. She turned to Harris, raising an eyebrow. Really? He grinned. Figured you'd want to be involved. Naomi sighed, but a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was time to start giving back. Later that night, after the event had wound down, Naomi sat outside the community center, staring up at the night sky. She had thought today would be just another day. But instead, she had seen something she hadn't in a long time, people coming together for something bigger than themselves. She had spent years believing she had to fight alone. But now, she wasn't so sure. Harris sat down beside her, stretching his legs out in front of him. You okay? Naomi exhaled slowly. I think so. He nodded. Good. They sat in silence for a moment before Naomi spoke again. You said earlier that this was about making sure no one else gets left behind. Harris nodded. She turned to him, her voice quiet but steady. I want to be a part of that. Harris smiled. You already are. And for the first time in a long time, Naomi believed it. Naomi woke up the next morning feeling different. It wasn't exhaustion that weighed on her this time. It was something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. She had spent so long focused on surviving, on putting one foot in front of the other, that she hadn't thought much about anything beyond that. But last night had changed things. The No One Walks Alone initiative was more than just a fundraiser. It was a movement. And somehow, she was at the center of it. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that. But something in her told her it was time to try. After getting the kids ready for school, Naomi made the short drive, something that still felt surreal, to drop them off. Caleb, ever observant, glanced at her before getting out of the car. You're thinking about something, he said. Naomi chuckled. I'm always thinking about something. But this is different. She exhaled, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. It's a good different. Caleb studied her for a moment, then nodded. Okay. Maya, still half asleep, just mumbled, "Love you, Mommy," before hopping out of the car. Naomi smiled as she watched them go. Then she turned toward the community center. The center was quieter in the morning, but a few volunteers were already inside setting things up. Naomi hesitated at the entrance, suddenly unsure of herself. What was she even doing here? She wasn't an organizer. She wasn't someone people looked up to. But when she stepped inside, she saw a familiar face. Officer Harris was sitting at one of the tables, flipping through a notebook. He looked up the moment she walked in. Didn't expect to see you this early, he said, standing up. Naomi shrugged, crossing her arms. Figured I should come by. See how this whole thing works. Harris smirked. So, you're officially in. She hesitated before nodding. Yeah, I guess I am. He nodded approvingly. Good. A woman nearby, one of the volunteers from last night, walked over and handed Naomi a clipboard. Welcome to the team, she said with a warm smile. We're getting a list of people who might need help with transportation. Some just need temporary rides, others are looking for something more permanent. Naomi looked down at the clipboard. There were already several names written down. People just like her. People who had been walking, struggling, pushing forward because they had no other choice. And now, maybe they had one. She swallowed hard and nodded. Where do I start? Naomi spent the rest of the morning learning how the initiative worked. There were different parts to it: volunteer drivers who could give people rides, a partnership with the local bus service to get discounted fares, and even a section where mechanics like Sam offered discounted repairs for people who couldn't afford them. It was more organized than she expected. And the more she saw, the more she realized just how much work went into making something like this happen. She had never been on this side of things before. She had always been the one struggling, the one surviving. Now, for the first time, she was in a position to help someone else. And that felt good. Harris approached her as she was reading through some of the paperwork. "You doing okay?" he asked. Naomi exhaled, rubbing her temples. "This is a lot." He chuckled. "Yeah, it is." She shook her head. "I had no idea how much effort went into something like this." Harris nodded. "That's how change happens. One step at a time." Naomi looked around, watching the volunteers as they worked, as they planned, as they figured out how to make life just a little easier for people who needed it. Then she looked back at Harris. "You really believe this can work?" His expression was steady. "Sure. I know it can." Naomi wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere along the way, she had started believing that too. That afternoon, she picked up Caleb and Maya from school. As they got in the car, Maya chatted about her day, while Caleb sat quietly, watching her. "What is it?" she asked him. Caleb hesitated before speaking. "You look different." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" He shrugged. "I don't know. You just seem happier." She blinked, caught off guard. Happier? She wasn't sure when that had happened. But as she drove home, she realized Caleb was right. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. Later that evening, after putting the kids to bed, Naomi sat at the kitchen table with her notepad. She had written a list a few nights ago. Goals. She had opened a savings account that morning. She had found a local program that offered free laptops to kids in need. Caleb's name was already on the list. And now, she was looking into night school. It had been a long time since she had thought about going back. She had always been too tired, too busy, too overwhelmed just trying to keep her head above water. But now, maybe it wasn't impossible. She circled the words night school and exhaled. One step at a time. The next day, Naomi walked into the community center with a new sense of purpose. Harris was already there, talking to a group of volunteers. When he saw her, he gave her a small nod. "You're back," he said. Naomi smirked. "Told you I was in." He grinned. "Good." Then he held out a folder. "What's this?" she asked. "Something I thought you might be interested in," he said. She opened it and frowned. Inside was information about a scholarship program for working parents trying to go back to school. Her stomach flipped. "You're really not gonna let me do anything the way I planned, are you?" she muttered. Harris chuckled. "Nope." Naomi exhaled, shaking her head. But she was smiling. For the first time in a long time, she was actually excited about the future. She didn't know exactly where this new path would lead. But she knew one thing. She wasn't walking it alone anymore. Naomi sat in her car outside the community center, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For the past few days, she had thrown herself into the No One Walks Alone initiative. She had met people whose stories were just like hers, mothers waking up before dawn to make it to their jobs, fathers struggling to keep their cars running, young adults walking miles to classes because they couldn't afford transportation. She had never realized how many people were silently enduring the same struggles she had. Now, for the first time, she had a chance to do something about it. And yet, she still wasn't sure if she belonged here. She exhaled slowly, pushing away the doubt, then stepped out of the car. Inside, the community center was already buzzing with activity. Volunteers were sorting through ride schedules, mechanics were discussing repair plans, and the donation table was stacked with envelopes. Naomi spotted Harris near the front, talking to a few local business owners. When he saw her, he waved her over. She hesitated for only a second before walking toward him. "Morning," he said with a grin. "Morning," she replied. "Perfect timing. I was just telling these guys about you." Naomi frowned. "About me?" Harris turned to the business owners. "Naomi was the first person we helped through this program. And now, she's helping us keep it going." The older man in the group, Mr. Thompson, owner of a local grocery store, nodded. "I've seen you at the hospital. Didn't know you were walking that far every day." Naomi swallowed. "I didn't really talk about it." "Well, I'm glad you're here now," Thompson said. "We need more people who understand what it's like." Naomi blinked, caught off guard by how easily they welcomed her. She had spent so much of her life keeping her struggles to herself, but here, they weren't just acknowledged, they mattered. Harris clapped his hands together. "All right, let's get to work." The morning was filled with meetings and planning. Naomi found herself sitting at a long table with other volunteers, going over requests from people who needed transportation assistance. A woman named Teresa, a single mother with a young daughter, needed rides to work until she could save enough to fix her car. An older man named Richard had been walking 5 miles just to get to his doctor's appointments. A college student named Jake had been skipping classes because he couldn't afford the bus fare. Every name on the list hit Naomi like a punch to the gut. These weren't just requests. They were stories. Stories like hers. And now, she had the power to help. "We can set up a rotating schedule for Teresa," one of the volunteers suggested. "A few of us can take turns giving her rides. I can take Richard to his appointments," another volunteer offered. "I'll reach out to Jake's school," Harris said. "Maybe we can set something up with the administration to cover his bus fare." Naomi listened carefully, absorbing every detail. Then, before she could stop herself, she spoke. "I want to help with Teresa." The table turned to her in surprise. Harris raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Naomi nodded. "I know what it's like. She's a mom, just trying to keep things together. If I can make things a little easier for her, I want to." A smile spread across Harris's face. "All right then." And just like that, Naomi had taken her first official step from receiving help to giving it. That evening, Naomi drove to Teresa's apartment. She hadn't done anything like this before, offering help instead of just surviving her own struggles. She had no idea what to expect. Teresa lived in a small, run-down apartment complex, the kind Naomi knew all too well. She knocked on the door, shifting on her feet as she waited. A moment later, the door opened, and a tired-looking woman in her late 20s appeared, holding a small girl on her hip. "Are you Teresa?" Naomi asked. The woman blinked. "Yeah, I'm Naomi," she said. "I'm part of the No One Walks Alone initiative. I'll be giving you rides to work for the next few weeks." Teresa's eyes widened. "Seriously?" Naomi nodded. For a second, Teresa just stared at her. Then, her shoulders slumped with relief. "Oh my God," she breathed. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Naomi smiled. "Actually, I do." Teresa let out a shaky laugh, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I thought I was gonna lose my job. I can't afford a car repair right now, and the buses don't run early enough." "I know the feeling," Naomi said. "But you don't have to do this alone." Teresa nodded, her eyes shining with gratitude. Naomi knew that feeling, too. The next morning, Naomi pulled up to Teresa's apartment bright and early. As Teresa climbed into the car, she let out a long sigh. "It feels weird sitting in a car instead of walking." Naomi chuckled. "Yeah, it takes some getting used to." They drove in silence for a while before Teresa spoke again. "So, how'd you get involved in this?" Naomi hesitated. Then, she decided to tell the truth. "I used to walk, too," she admitted. "Every day, to work and back. My car broke down months ago, and I didn't have the money to fix it." Teresa turned to her, eyes wide. "Seriously?" Naomi nodded. "Yeah." Then one day, Officer Harris noticed. "And before I knew it, people were helping me." Teresa shook her head in disbelief. "I didn't know people actually did stuff like that." "Neither did I," Naomi admitted. They pulled into the parking lot of the diner where Teresa worked. Before getting out, Teresa turned to Naomi. "You know, I've spent so long thinking no one gives a damn," she said. "But maybe I was wrong." Naomi smiled. "Yeah, I thought that too." Teresa nodded, then took a deep breath. "When I get back on my feet, I want to help, too." Naomi's chest tightened. That was how it happened. One person helped another. And then another. Until no one had to struggle alone. "That's how it starts," Naomi said softly. Teresa smiled. "Then I guess this is just the beginning." That night, Naomi sat at her kitchen table, staring at her goals list. She had started it as a way to rebuild her life. But now, she realized it wasn't just about her anymore. She picked up her pen and added one more thing to the list. 5. Help someone the way I was helped. She smiled. One step at a time. And for the first time in years, she knew, she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was making a difference. And that was everything. Naomi sat on her front porch, sipping a cup of tea as the sun began to set. A soft breeze rustled the leaves in the small tree beside her home, and for once, she wasn't weighed down by exhaustion. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. It had been weeks since she had officially joined the No One Walks Alone initiative, and every day since then had been a lesson in change. She had spent so many years struggling, convinced that she had to do everything alone. But now, things were different. Now, she was part of something bigger. And it had changed everything. As she took another sip of tea, her phone buzzed on the table beside her. A text from Harris. Harris, big meeting at the community center tomorrow. You in? Naomi smirked, shaking her head before replying. Naomi, of course. I'm always in. She set her phone down, exhaling slowly. A year ago, she never would have imagined this. But now, she couldn't imagine anything else. The next morning, Naomi arrived at the community center, the air buzzing with energy. Volunteers were setting up tables, stacking papers, and getting everything in place for the meeting. She spotted Harris near the front, talking to a few of the organizers. When he saw her, he grinned. Look who finally decided to become a regular? Naomi rolled her eyes. Like I said, I'm in. Harris chuckled. Good. Because today's a big day. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Bigger than usual. He nodded. We're expanding. Naomi blinked. Expanding? Harris gestured toward a large poster board that had been set up near the entrance. She stepped closer, reading the bold letters at the top. No one walks alone, a community united. Underneath, there were new sections added to the initiative, plans to provide emergency car repairs for low-income families, a mentorship program for young adults trying to find work, and a ride-sharing system for elderly residents who needed transportation to doctor's appointments. Naomi let out a slow breath. It was bigger than she ever could have imagined. She turned back to Harris. How did all of this happen? Harris shrugged. People saw what was possible, and they wanted to do more. Naomi shook her head in disbelief. She had spent so long thinking no one cared. But she had been wrong. So wrong. The meeting began a short while later, with the room filled with volunteers, local business owners, and members of the community. Naomi sat near the front, listening as Harris stood up to speak. This started with one person, he said, his voice steady. One person who was walking miles every day, just trying to get to work. One person who thought no one noticed her. Naomi felt a lump form in her throat. She knew he was talking about her. Harris continued. But when people saw what she was going through, they realized something. They realized she wasn't the only one. And instead of looking the other way, they stepped up. He glanced around the room. This initiative isn't just about transportation. It's about what happens when a community comes together. When we look out for each other. When we make sure that no one is left behind. A wave of murmurs and nods moved through the crowd. Naomi's hands clenched together in her lap. She had never been one for attention. But today, she didn't feel like she was being put on display. She felt like she was part of something real. Something that mattered. Harris smiled. And now, I'd like to introduce someone who knows better than anyone what this initiative means. Naomi's heart skipped. Harris turned to her. Naomi, would you like to say a few words? A hush fell over the room. Naomi froze. She hadn't planned for this. Hadn't expected it. Her first instinct was to say no, to shake her head and let Harris keep talking. But then she looked at the faces around her. The volunteers who had stepped up. The people who had helped her. The people she had helped. And she realized she had something to say. Taking a deep breath, she stood. The room went silent. She swallowed, gripping the edge of the table for support. I used to think no one noticed me, she said, her voice quiet but steady. I used to think that if I wanted to survive, I had to do everything on my own. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the people who had made this possible. I was wrong. A murmur moved through the crowd. Naomi took another breath. For months, I walked. Every day. I told myself that was just how life was. That I had to keep going, no matter how hard it got. She let her gaze drift to Harris. But then, someone noticed. Her voice grew stronger. And then, others noticed too. She let out a small, shaky laugh. I didn't know what to do with that at first. I didn't know how to accept help. But I've learned something in the past few weeks. She looked at Teresa, who was sitting near the back, smiling through tears. I've learned that accepting help isn't weakness. She let the words settle. It's strength. Another murmur moved through the crowd, this time filled with agreement. Naomi felt something shift inside her. For a long time, I thought I was alone. She paused. But I see now, I never was. I just didn't know how to look. A wave of emotion crashed over her. She cleared her throat, voice softening. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has ever struggled in silence. And it's about making sure that no one else has to." She exhaled. "Thank you." The room erupted in applause. Naomi felt her heart pound as she sat back down, her hands shaking. Harris leaned over, grinning. "That," he said, "was perfect." Naomi let out a breathless laugh. "I can't believe you made me do that." He smirked. "I didn't make you do anything. That was all you." Naomi looked around, watching as people wiped at their eyes, nodded in agreement, and leaned closer to one another. And for the first time, she truly believed it. This was just the beginning. That night, as she drove home, she felt lighter than she had in years. She wasn't the same woman who had walked miles every day, head down, carrying the weight of the world alone. She was part of something now. She was part of change. And as she pulled into her driveway, she glanced at her goals list one more time. With a small smile, she picked up a pen and wrote, 6, keep moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, she knew she wasn't walking alone anymore. She never had to again. The end.